success in the international economy is of enormous importance both to our nation and the local economy. And certainly over the next few months and even years, the leadership of this community will be reflecting upon Maryland's role in the international economy and forging appropriate approaches. Therefore, the topic of tonight's panel, Strategies for Maryland and the International Economy, is both timely and of basic importance. Already, the governor, of course, as you know, has created a Commission on World Trade Efforts, which is due to report in December. It's chaired by Mr. Morrill. And speaking before the Council and Institute last spring, the governor noted his plan to create an office in DECD for enhancing trade. Mr. DeFrancis is well known for emphasizing the importance of the global economy to Maryland and for advocating close cooperation between the private and public sectors in that effort. The Greater Baltimore Committee, and Mr. Moyer in particular, has been studying the structure and direction of this community's economy. And the Port, as you know, is constantly assessing the long-term direction of the vital sector for which it's responsible. And the Council and Institute are especially pleased to welcome these gentlemen, Mr. DeFrancis, Mr. Halpin, and Mr. Morrill. All are trustees of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. And Mr. Moyer is a longtime friend of the Council, and his boss, Mr. Keller, is a member of our Board of Trustees. And of course, Mr. Halpin's Port Administration sponsors the World Trade Center Institute. The panelists, I know, are known to nearly all of you quite well, but allow just a couple of words on them. Mr. DeFrancis was appointed to his present cabinet-level post in January of 1984 by the governor. Previously, he has held a number of interesting positions. Most recently, he served as president and chairman of the board of directors of Free State Racing Association from its inception in 1980. He's engaged in private law practice, specializing in international and corporate matters. He's established a number of corporations engaged in both overseas and domestic tourism and travel activities, with offices in the United States, the Far East, and in Europe. Mr. Halpin, you've been reading a lot about for a number of years. He's been with the Port Authorities. He joined the Port Authority in 1959. He served as Director of Communications, as Executive Assistant to the Executive Director, and served as Deputy Port Administrator before assuming his present post as Maryland Port Administrator in 1978. He served as he's presently a director of the International Association of Ports and Harbors. He's been president of the North Atlantic Ports Association. He's now serving as chairman of the American Association of Port Authorities, the industry group representing all of the major ports of North and South America. Mr. Moyer, it always interests me when this is the case, has a Master of Divinity degree from the Lutheran Theological Seminary in 1954, before moving on to get a Master of Science degree in Community Organization with the highest honors. I assume highest honors really means success in this case.
We'll find out later.
He's held a, well, he should have something to do with success. He was senior advisor to John D. Rockefeller IV when he was Secretary of State of West Virginia. So there's an ongoing connection with success, I assume.
Doesn't hurt.
He's held a number of positions of executive stature with respect to economic development. He was director of the Governor's Office of Economic and Community Development of the state of West Virginia before coming here. Mr. Morrill's a native of our community, known to many of you as being the builder and major mover in Maryland National's international division since 1959. At present, he has recently joined as senior vice president Abu Dhabi's International Bank. That's on the Persian Gulf. At least their headquarters on the Persian Gulf. Mr. Morrill's operating out of Washington, D.C., of course. The community activities of Mr. Morrill are numerous. They don't need repetition. He's a graduate of Yale University. As I mentioned, he's been a member of this council's board of trustees for a long time. I hope that wasn't too long, but the gentlemen should be introduced to you. We're delighted that they're with us. Our format this evening will be that they will each make a statement of 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll give them an opportunity to exchange comments at that time. We'll take a slight pause to allow those of you who have to leave early to do so. We'll then have a Q&A session, which will be extensive and last until 7:40. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our panel. Mr. Morrill will speak first, followed by Mr. Moyer, Mr. Halpin, and Mr. DeFrancis.
Thank you, Frank. As Frank has said, Governor Hughes, in a speech delivered to this Foreign Affairs Council last May, said that he will present a comprehensive state trade program to the 1985 legislature, and that the work of the World Trade Efforts Commission will be incorporated into that legislative package. As chairman of that commission, I'd like to use my initial time today to give you an idea of what the commission has been doing since it was created, and what it hopes to do when its report is finalized. I believe it is accurate to say that the World Trade Efforts Commission was created in an atmosphere of some concern. In the private sector, involvement in foreign trade in general and in exports in particular were below expectations, both in Maryland and indeed throughout the United States, for a variety of reasons, including complacency created by the fact that the American business community had always had an enormous domestic market to serve, complexities stemming from different laws and trading patterns abroad, individually uncontrollable impediments to exporting, such as the strong dollar and recession in some major markets, lack of appropriate financing, and inexperience, and in some cases, ignorance. In the public sector, Maryland has been blessed with a governor who realizes that foreign trade touches everyone's lives. In 1979, he embarked on a phased process of selling Maryland abroad through trips, making his first one to China in 1980. He has encouraged business exchanges at many levels. Despite the LDC crisis, the international activities of the private sector have been increasing. For example, Maryland and Washington banks have been expanding their ability to finance trade into and out of the Mid-Atlantic region. Sister city and state agreements have been initiated, foreign trade zones created, and some very important trade and investment agreements finalized. And so there has been progress. Yet the concern persists that we have not done enough. From a purely statistical standpoint, only, and I use that word advisedly, only approximately 54,000 Marylanders depend on international trade for their jobs, and this represents only about 3% of all the jobs in the state, as against a national average of about 6%. While most states in the United States export on the average of 8% of their state product, Maryland exports only about 4% of its product. So the question remains, are we doing enough? And the answer, in my opinion, is no. Against this background, the World Trade Efforts Commission is now developing recommendations which we hope will enable Marylanders to enter and succeed in international trade, a business area which I think we all would agree has enormous potential. Amid the general concern last fall, there was also a potential opportunity. A piece of federal legislation known as the Export Trading Company Act of 1982. This act, as some of you may know, encourages almost any conceivable combination of firms, banks, cities to get together to make exporting easier, quicker, and more profitable. The Act removes antitrust concerns which formerly precluded these business combinations, and it's particularly directed at encouraging small and medium-sized companies. Governor Hughes, in setting up the World Trade Efforts Commission, gave a clear mandate. First, to evaluate the appropriate role for the state under the Export Trading Company Act of 1982, if indeed there is a role. And second, to study how to develop a state and private cooperative effort to improve world trade results in Maryland. Today, as many of you also know, there are a lot of entities looking at or having actually formed export trading companies. The Port of New York, New Jersey, the City of Philadelphia, Newport News, and a large number of banks and leading industrial firms. Unfortunately, the results to date of these activities have been marginal to poor. In its investigation, the Commission has tried to address the following issues. First, should Maryland establish an export trading company? Second, how, if at all, does an export trading company fit in with Maryland's import and export strategies, if indeed it has import and export strategies? And third, if the formation of an ETC is not appropriate, what other things need to be done to ensure that trade activities are an integral part of the state's economic development strategy? The Commission, in its work, has pursued two paths. First, 4 public hearings were held in locations throughout the state, Hagerstown, Upper Marlboro, Cambridge, and Baltimore City, right here in this room, as a matter of fact. Also, during last spring and summer, the Commission held 8 other meetings to give individuals and small groups who had not had an opportunity to contribute to the public meetings an opportunity to be heard. Finally, the Commission has held 5 meetings, with a 6th scheduled for next week, to discuss and refine its findings and to formulate its report, which is due on the governor's desk by December 1st at the latest. In view of the fact that our report is not yet complete, I can't discuss specific recommendations. On the other hand, it's certainly appropriate to discuss here tonight some of the issues which have been raised in the course of our investigation and my personal reactions to those issues. And since we have an opportunity a little later to discuss these points in depth, I would submit very briefly that first, Maryland needs a focal point, an Office of International Trade Activities, ideally supported by a high-level advisory commission. Secondly, the state has great resources, including the professionals working for Frank and for Greg. And we need to better coordinate their activities with the professionals working in international trade in the private sector. Thirdly, the importers, exporters, and service firms operating in Maryland and potential entrants into international trade have legitimate needs. We can do a better job of serving those needs, which fall broadly into the areas of education, financing, and marketing. We need to increase the attention the state pays to these areas. Now, we're here tonight to discuss planning, and I'm convinced that these are some of the issues which must be addressed in any overall plan. Strategic planning, as most of us know, is a never-ending exercise which at its best solicits the input of everyone who has a legitimate interest in the subject and something positive to contribute, which is why we are all here. I look forward to our discussion later. Thank you.
It occurs to me that the audience might benefit from the personal experience of 3 of your panelists. There are 3 of us up here who are biologically operating at about 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. Frank DeFrancis and Greg Halpin and I have come back from mutually coordinated but different tracks to East Asia. Greg just arrived back from Peking yesterday, Frank from Hong Kong just a few days earlier, and I from Tokyo about the same day Frank got from Hong Kong, I think. And as we've talked to one another, we kind of drift a little bit, so that could happen, but I doubt it. It reflects something. You were coming from Washington.
From Washington. So
that may cause more drift than ours.
Oh, you're right.
I think that the role casting that you are presented with on this panel is more than a little significant as Marylanders consider seriously the future of strategies in an emerging international economy. I represent not the private sector in its strictest sense, as does Griff Morrow, who is the employee of a private institution, profit-making and pursuing that, and serves in a civic capacity as a chairman of the commission on which he's just reported. I serve as a professional director with 25 years' experience in the business of coordinating private sector interests in the area of economic development. I am in Maryland, delightfully so. After having shipped so damn much coal through this port from West Virginia, I decided to get closer to where the money's made. And it's been a delight to be here and to learn how much we know about the international market, which has fed and nourished this economy of Maryland since its founding way, way back a long time ago. 350 years we celebrate, but the active part of this port has been vigorously commercial in the area of international trade for 200 years, and it's one of the things that we sell overseas. But we have emerged at a time when I think Frank and Greg can tell you more specifically, and I can reference, because I did bring some of the notes, fellas, if your memory on the data on trade and port handling, if you want some specifics, I have it. But let them report on the accurate picture so we frame the reference. The key thing I think that can be said today is that Maryland is not competing effectively. One would think that after 200 years we'd be at the front of the pack. But the truth of the matter is, in this, as in many other areas of our economy, Maryland is not very competitive. Maryland tends to lag somewhere in the middle of the pack on almost every economic index that anyone has conjured up to measure competitiveness among the states. I cite that not as a matter of personal opinion, but as a result of the findings of a 2-year effort which has just recently been completed. It's called the Maryland Economic Growth Coalition Project. The project was generated about 2 years ago because there was a growing concern at the level of top corporate leadership, that is the CEOs of the major employers in the private sector across Maryland, met in an organization known as the Maryland Business Roundtable. There were about 40 of them. And their concern was prompted because of their perception at the time that something was going on in the economy of the state of Maryland that they weren't sure of the roots of, but they didn't like the symptoms of. And it had to do with Maryland's loss to Virginia, quite dramatically, of a couple of widely reported projects. One, the much-reported Fairchild move of the headquarters, and the other was the loss and failure of those of us in Baltimore and Maryland who worked hard to bring AT&T's headquarters here, and we failed. And we failed after having been told by the officials of AT&T that we had the best business case. But we lost it anyway. Well, that concerned the leaders. And the other thing that happened at that same time is there was kind of a growing malaise, is the only thing I can say, is kind of a general cocktail party chatter that was running around in all the circles that all of us run in rooms like this. And one report would feed on another report. And when you'd press and say, well, why do you say the business climate is so bad? You'd often say, well, I just feel it is. Well, out of that came a concern, let's dig in and get some of the facts. Let's find out how competitive Maryland really is. And if there's something that's dragging down our competitiveness, maybe we can find it and figure out what we ought to do about it. Well, that started the Maryland Economic Growth Coalition Project. It was supported by the Business Roundtable, which I reported, by the Economic Development Council of Greater Baltimore, which I'm the professional director, by the Maryland State Chamber, and supported as a policy matter by the Board of the Greater Baltimore Committee. Financially, it has cost the three financial sponsoring organizations, the Chamber, the Council, and the Roundtable, almost $300,000. We have used the best national economic consultants, but most importantly, Frank Lucier, who agreed, as he was the outgoing chairman of Black & Decker and widely experienced in international trade and business, that he would be willing to spend up to 50% of his time for at least a year if the Economic Development Council would commit up to 50% of my time for a year, and that we would in turn supervise the consultants but do one other very, very big and important thing, and that is travel the length and breadth of Maryland and talk to Marylanders who are concerned about the economy and the economic growth in Maryland. Well, we did that. We came back, and obviously I can't give the whole report here tonight, but what I would like to say is that at the conclusion of that two-year effort, which we've just recently reported to a meeting of the executives of the representative groups, we find that we indeed are in the middle of the pack in many things. We indeed are not as competitive as a state as we might be, and it shows up in international trade as it does in other areas. But we also found that it's within our power to change that. But if we do decide to change it, there are a series of consistent actions that are going to have to take place in the public sector by way of articulated policy, followed up by active, professionally supported programs, and then coordinated in the private sector as represented by Mr. Morrill, in private profit-making institutions, and in the not-for-profit private sector as represented by myself, where coordinative efforts are undertaken at all times to bring together top leaders of the business community, that all those groups are going to have to move and gradually build a wider coalition of interests that include organized labor, the academic institutions of the state, business at all levels, and the media. And that the minimum amount of time necessary to achieve significant change in rank is not going to be a flash-in-the-pan overnight sensation of 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. The minimum time, based upon the research and based upon the comparative analysis of the states who have been winning while we've been holding steady, is 10 years. Now, it's within our power. We can do it. And quite frankly, the reason I'm delighted to be in Maryland to be a part of it is that I've got some working colleagues like the gentleman to my right who are in the appropriate sectors and who share an intelligent and also, I believe, a passionate concern to make Maryland a hell of a lot more competitive than it is today.
I'm going to have to approach this problem a little differently, and if the one thing I bring is not the fact that I'm disoriented, but I have what is known as the Beijing crud, which is a respiratory ailment that you pick up in about 24 hours in China. I might add we also picked up some very nice business, so with the bad came the good. Let me first start out with some very fundamental things to talk to you about, and if I sound like I'm being very simplistic, forgive me for a moment, but I do think it's very, very important. When we talk about international trade, there are two words that we almost always use, and those words are export and import. And the interesting part about those two words is that there's something common to both of them, and it's the last four letters. It's called P-O-R-T, which is port. And that simply means that while we are so tremendously dependent on trade, we are totally dependent on ports to handle that trade, something which we in the port industry have had a great difficulty in convincing certain people of. I love to tell the story about a president who will remain unnamed who at a certain time was delivering a State of the Union message, and of course being a little wise, I do not listen to State of the Union messages, but my wife, God rest her soul, was listening to it and called out to me and said, "I believe the President of the United States just used the word port." in his State of the Union message. I said, absolutely impossible. He doesn't know how to spell it, doesn't know what it means. There is no possible way he could be using it. And in fact, he did use the word port, and it took the senior senator from the state of Maryland 2 visits to the White House to convince him to put one sentence in the State of the Union message that included the word port for the first time in the history of the Republic of the US of A world globe. Which means that we in the port industry have got some problems, and it's one of the reasons why your harbor has not been dredged, frankly. It's one of the reasons your harbor hasn't been dredged. I didn't add frankly to suggest that Mr. DeFrancis had anything to do with the lack of dredge. In speaking to this point, and the reason I make it is that the position that I hold is one that has the responsibility of trying to move a tremendous amount of cargo through the Port of Baltimore. The more the better. The problem I have, in a sense, in this panel is that we move it mostly through and not in. We are not, in effect, an East Coast port, as we try to tell people all around the world. We are a Midwest port. Our target, our market, our hinterland is the Midwest United States. We spend our advertising money, our solicitation efforts in that area. Were we to be dependent on the port, on this area, Washington and Baltimore, you would need probably no more than the old piers that have been replaced by the inner harbor. And you certainly would not need, and there were a lot of people who would think that that was a blessing, the Maryland Port Administration. Now, as we look at international trade today, the Port Administration obviously has to look, therefore, first at what is going on in the world and then relate to it what we can do to attract more of that trade into our own state. Let me try to give you our very, very quick review of world trade and then against that, the problems we have. My favorite ambassador, whom we were with not too long ago, Mike Mansfield, has said on 2 occasions, and I'm glad he did because I keep quoting, and I'm glad I quote him accurately, that the next century is the century of the Pacific. And I think that Mr. Mansfield is absolutely right. And we will look at trade increases. We, in our area, are looking at Korea, we are looking at Indonesia, we're looking at the Malaysian Peninsula, we're looking at Japan, and we're looking, of course, at China. And we think that that is where trade growth is going to come in the future. I consider myself, after 3 trips to China, not an expert, but at least someone who has a great interest in that country. And I was in total shock when I got out of the airport about a week ago in Beijing. I had not been there for 4 years, and the change is absolutely astounding and incredible about what is going on in that country, despite the fact that people keep saying the growth has been slow. To be there 4 years ago and to see it today indicates that when all the problems are solved, this is going to be a tremendous growth area, and it's going to be taking its place along with Korea and with Japan and those other remarkable areas of the world that has grown so quickly. We look at Europe and the Mediterranean and places like this as stable areas that may have some growth but not dramatic growth. We do not yet look at the African continent as one that is going to grow significantly. We do think that South America may have some growth potential in the next 10 to 20 years. So if, in fact, the Far East is our major trading area, if the Far East constitutes right now about 34% of the trade coming through this port, if in fact it has surpassed Europe for the first time in the history of this port as its major trading area, how is the port related to the Far East? That is, of course, the interesting story. Ports are not places in which you see boats unloaded and loaded. They are not places where you see cranes and container facilities. They are markets. If you want to know the size of your port, the first thing you know is the size of your market. Don't show me your port, show me your market, and I'll tell you whether you're a big port or a small port. Baltimore is a big port because we serve a big market, which is Midwest United States. New York is a big port, getting to be smaller, a neighborhood port, but it serves an awfully large neighborhood. And the South Atlantic ports are growing because they serve the emerging market of Southeast United States. The biggest container port in the United States in 5 years, and probably the biggest container port in the world, will be Los Angeles, Long Beach. And it will be matched as a super port with Kobe and Rotterdam and maybe one other port in the world as a truly super port. It has already incidentally surpassed New York. And that is simply because it is serving the biggest growth market, which is the Pacific Rim area. So how does Baltimore look at the Far East? Well, that's very, very interesting, because what has happened in the Far East is we have a little thing called bridge. Now, the bridge movement is a very simple transportation system in which cargo emanating or going to the Pacific area is transferred by ship across the Pacific Ocean, then unloaded, put on rail cars, and brought to the East Coast instead of coming through the Panama Canal and into our ports on the East Coast by water. We estimate that anywhere from 35 to 40% of the traffic that used to be delivered to the East Coast by water is now being delivered by rail. One of the long-range strategies is what Mr. Moyer was just talking about, what Griff was talking about, and I'm sure what Secretary DeFrancis is talking about. And that is that the more we develop international trade in Maryland, the more obviously we capture that trade to the Port of Baltimore. We are happy to report that Black & Decker does not ship its goods out of the Port of Philadelphia, New York. They happen to use our port, and we suspect they'll use our port for a long time. You will remember that Bethlehem Steel, of course, has been a tremendous user of our port. Those industries which can be located in our area, which in turn are involved in international trade, are, as far as we're concerned, golden industries. They not only help the economy of the state, they help the economy of the port, which also helps the economy of the state. It's sort of a double-dipping economic benefit for the state. Therefore, anything that can be done to encourage the increase of trade that is local is, of course, tremendous benefit for the port, which is one of the reasons why on my side of the state bureaucracy, within the Department of Transportation, working with Secretary Hellman, we have been developing, along with Secretary DeFrancis' group and the governor's people, the trade program that the governor will be announcing shortly. The heart of that program is obviously to maximize all of the resources that we have so that in a coordinated effort, a maximum coordinated effort, we may be sure that we are presenting the best light of this state and this port to the world so that we may involve ourselves even more effectively in what is going to happen in the world of trade. The world of trade as such, as we see it, is obviously going to continue to grow. As it does, ports themselves are going to fall into certain categories, as at least I see it. They're going to fall into the category of a super load center port, and I already mentioned I think there'll only be one in the United States, will be Los Angeles and Long Beach. I think probably Kobe and Rotterdam will survive as in that category. There will then be load center ports, and that's what we are striving to achieve, and I think we've already at least achieved that category at this time. We are in a very precarious situation. We have fierce competition coming at us from just about every area, the South Atlantic, Canada, and the West Coast. We are devising our marketing strategies to meet that as best we can. The final solution to that, of course, is going to be, once again, total coordination between the private and public sector in this port and total coordination between the private and public sector and international trade in this state. I am very confident that this port is going to survive as a load center port. However, that confidence is certainly not based on any kind of smugness. A recent trip to the Far East indicates a couple of things. Number one, our presence in the Far East is very solid. We've had 16 years of experience of selling in the Far East. We are very well known. I'm happy to say that we're probably better known, and I'm sure better respected in Beijing and Tokyo than we are in Baltimore, and in one sense that's as it should be. Keep in mind, please keep in mind, that the critical decisions for the Port of Baltimore have been made and will be made in Copenhagen, Hamburg, Southampton, London, Tokyo, Beijing, Taipei, Hong Kong, and Seoul. It's the people in those areas who have to make the decision on port selection. These are the people that we have to constantly be reaching out to, and these are the people that we have to educate on the Port of Baltimore. I think they're well educated, and I think that they'll be better educated in the future as we better coordinate our efforts. The port is healthy, but the health of the port is something that all of us in our own personal health have to maintain, and we have to continue to maintain the health of the port. As far as I'm concerned, one of the major ways we do that is for expanded cooperation between all the public and private agencies involved in trade in this port, and I'm very personally delighted to be, at this time, part of that effort, which all of you will be exposed to in the months ahead under the governor's leadership and, incidentally, under the leadership of the gentleman who I will turn the microphone over to right now.
Being in the last post position gives you certain prerogatives, and with your permission, I'll go to the podium because I can't see the quadrant to my left here.
like Don, I suffer probably more so because I'm older than he is, a lot more from travel. But there were, outside of my family, there are two things that have dominated my life. One is international activity, and the other is racing. Since you can read more about racing in the newspaper, let me confine myself to international activities. As a younger man, I represented the German government for over some 24 years. And as a consequence, I had the privilege of not watching a corporation grow, but watching a country grow. When I first went to Germany as a very, very young lawyer, I don't think there was one city in which there were more than a building that had 5 or 6 stories. And through the years, to see the growth of that country and the position that it took in the international field, in international trade, was something that I really thank the good Lord for, and was an opportunity that I thought would never come to me again. In the last 11 months, I've experienced a rejuvenation of spirit in regard to the possibilities and the potential of seeing, as I did for almost a quarter of a century, a country grow in this field of international trade, to see something a lot closer and nearer and dearer to my heart, the state of Maryland grow, and the question in the field of international trade. When I accepted the governor's appointment, I felt the most set upon man in the state. And yet, as the months have developed, in working with him and working with the people to the right of me, and others as I see throughout the audience, it's been one of the greatest experiences of my life. Because you stand, we stand, at the same threshold that I saw Bonn, Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt stand at 15, 20 years ago. You have to travel. You know, and the next time I go to Europe would be the 9th or 10th time. The East has been something relatively foreign to me. I've been there only 2 or 3 times. 3 times. This is the 4th trip. What Greg experienced when he went to China, I'm just amazed. There's so much I want to share with you, and the 8 or 9 or 10 minutes that are allocated, it's very difficult. But let me just try to touch on a few things as it affects your lives in the state. You heard the speakers mention that the governor instituted this sister state relationship. At the time that he did, it was looked upon, I think, with a certain amount of skepticism in many quarters, what really was going to happen in this, just the mere name, sister state. You envision maybe some cultural exchanges, a bit of social activity. Maybe the media looked at it as an excuse to go on a jolly ride. The sister state relationship that he developed with the Anhui province in China 6 weeks ago resulted in a delegation coming from Anhui because of the confidence that they reposed in the state of Maryland through its governor and the relationship that had developed over 4 years, to come ahead and enter into several memorandums of understanding for contractual services and goods from the state of Maryland in excess of over $50 million. And at the time that happened, and I was shocked that the media reported it in sort of a blocked way as they were reporting, I don't know, the car had an accident down on Charles Street. Because the $50 million, and as their economic chief, I shouldn't disparage $50 or $60 million, but the unimportance of that is against the fact that China, after 40 years behind the bamboo curtain, has broken through and has begun foreign trade relationships with a state such as Maryland indicated a far-reaching foreign policy decision that obviously had to be made. And yet there was no subscription at all to that event, except 3 weeks later the front pages were filled with, there is a major foreign policy shift in China. Well, you saw that happening. And when you realize what the potential of over 1 billion people mean in the consumer market, what they mean in regard to their reaching out for westernization policies and westernization goods, and you realize that the state of Maryland is in the preemptive position that it is because of the governor and because of the General Assembly and because of what the leaders of this state have done in the past, you know, I can't share with you the excitement that you must feel in that regard, because a whole new world is emerging, a whole new position in regard to international trade and what it means to this state. And very simply stated, I don't care how you say it, whether you say a port, whether you say it international trade, whether you say it means jobs, it means the economic base of this state will be reflected in its tax rate. It affects the lives of each and every one of the people here that are obviously concerned with international trade. And all those people, as you look at the lights outside of here, they really don't know whether international trade, what it's all about. The impressions that another instance where it's so exciting, Taiwan government. The last 10 years, they've gone ahead and bought $6 billion worth of American goods, and yet they never visited the state of Maryland until a month ago. And one of the reasons, and the Taiwanese are very clever people, and obviously their national survival depends upon their judicious selection of partners. And therefore, obviously, the states that they trade in were states where their leaders took profound positions favoring the Taiwanese. But when it was pointed out to them that the location of Maryland is literally the second home to every national leader that we have in the United States, and therefore they are subject to our influences from our media, that they listen to our television and they read our newspapers, and as a consequence the importance of the state of Maryland through its geographical location to the input of the nation's leaders, Chairman Chang of that Trade Commission promised publicly that Maryland would be added to their customer list and indicated that there would be purchases of no less than $50 million for the next year. You heard Greg, and you know, I feel this is like Christmas. We sort of dangle these things. You know, where the World Trade Commission is working, they can't tell you what it is. Greg and I are working on it. Frankly, we can't tell you what that's all about. But obviously, you do know what the governor said in this room a few months ago, that he will be introducing an international trade program that will be one of the most far-reaching and most extensive of any state in the Union. And the reason why it will not only reach out to the export concept, because export today, with a dollar and the unrealistic position it is in regard to the franc or the yen or the mark, is one of the most difficult things to go ahead and to achieve. But the international trade program that he will envision will reach out and touch into the field of joint venture. It's one of the most exciting things that can happen to the state. You know, the Bethlehem Steels or the Black & Deckers, they don't need the vehicle of an international trade program introduced through a General Assembly to go ahead and understand what joint venture is about. But you know, out of the 75,000 firms that are in Maryland, 80% of the growth comes from 75% of those firms that have employees of 50 or under. So just like the strength of America is in its middle class and in its small people, the strength of the economy of this state is in the small and medium-sized firms that do business in this state. And to be able to go ahead and to give them a trade program which will permit them joint venture relationships with countries overseas and with firms in those countries, I think is a dimension that this state will employ. We're going to have in that international trade program barter arrangements. It's a unique concept, but one that if going ahead and worked within that, one of the most innovative and enterprising ways to develop the economy. I would say this to you, and I will conclude with this. One of the things that I learned, and I certainly share what the speakers before me have said, that the East, the Far East, is the wave of the future. When we called on Ambassador Mansfield, and the governor had his opening remark and said, could you give us some of your thoughts, Mr. Ambassador? Mansfield answered, "You're the 7th governor to visit me this month." And so when you can realize how the competition, because this is what it is, the world is changing. There's an absolute revolution going out of there. We not only live in the computer age, we not only send man out to do and retrieve satellites, but the world is changing. And so the capital investment as we know it, the foreign investment into the state of Maryland, into the United States, is one of the most sought-after commodities of the other 49 states that we're in competition to. And Maryland well better recognize its position and well better support that type of activity that will be absolutely vital to the economic lifeblood of this state. And by seeing the people that are here tonight in this room, crowded and filled as it is, I'm sure that Maryland is in very good hands. Thank you very much.
This question, however, is directed to anyone in the panel, and the question is, what might be done about increasing frequency of service to the port?
Let me start out with that. I assume you're talking about frequency of vessel service into the port. Let me first say that the port is well represented in every trade area of the world, with the exception of one, which is Australia. That's the one trade area in which we are somewhat weak for particular reasons. As far as frequency of service is concerned, we have recent studies indicate that the frequency of service in this port on the East Coast is second only to New York, and very close to New York, and in some cases is almost equal to New York. What has happened, of course, is that frequency of service equates to rationalization of service. And as container vessels particularly get larger, the concept is to make fewer port calls. This is happening not just here, but all around the world. And so where in the past you might have had a vessel call every week or two, you may get a larger vessel calling every 2 weeks or maybe every 10 days. We are pushing Baltimore as a load center port for round-the-world service. In round-the-world service, we will be getting additional services rather than fewer services. Other things that have happened is, as you get larger steamship lines, smaller steamship lines are finding it increasingly difficult to stay alive in this competitive business. One steamship line went bankrupt last week. This is about the 5th or 6th one this year. Obviously, that deletes the service somewhat. From a competitive standpoint, however, the statistics definitely prove that we are in a very strong position. New York does have more service than we have. However, the margin is not great. And aside from New York, we have more frequency of service than any port on the East Coast.
I would like to supplement something in that regard. And if we didn't have between the Department of Economic Development and the Department of Transportation a very fundamental working relationship, I'd keep my mouth shut, because this obviously would be construed to get me in hot water. But when you talk about frequency of service as it relates to BWI, what has been done there in the last few years is just amazing. It has gone now to the #1 airport handling international traffic over Dulles. But I think it's ludicrous that we don't have nonstop service to the West Coast. And I'm going to recommend, outside of World Airways, I see a gentleman looking very incredulous, and excuse me, with the exception of World, we don't have a nonstop service to the coast. And I think that's something that we must encourage, because the frequency of flights to the east from California or Washington or wherever to Japan is vital into the ultimate development of, I think, the trade relationships that we're going to have to ultimately evolve with the Far Eastern countries. And so this is one thing that I'm certainly going to discuss with the Secretary in the next days to come.
I would just add that I think that to the extent that we can increase participants in foreign trade, import, export, or whatever, then perhaps the vehicle, the ability to move it will follow with the increased interest and involvement in the Maryland community and in using those services.
Are you, Mr. Halpin, satisfied with federal assistance to the state of Maryland?
I'm never as satisfied when I'm given absolutely nothing. There has been no assistance. Let me say this, however, and something you should know when we talk about dredging. Right now, we have completed a little bit more than half of the first phase, which is a little bit more half of the maintenance of our main channel. That is a project that has gone unnoticed, and yet it is a project that is the largest single dredging project we've ever had in this port. It will end up placing somewhere in the neighborhood of, my memory's failing me at the moment, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 million cubic yards of material in Hart Miller Island, and it will give us an effective 44 feet of water, so that we're sort of sneaking up on the 50-foot channel project in that respect. We got close this year in Congress, as you know. There were 2 bills that passed, and 2 bills that got at least a fresh air look in the Congress, and in the last frantic days, those went down the tube, along with the efforts of our congressional delegation to get us about $15 million to get the channel project started. That's the closest we've gotten, the port industry has gotten, in something like 6 or 7 years. It is absolutely incredible that we, as a port industry, forgetting just Maryland now, have not been able to convince the federal government that dredging of our harbors is necessary. There has not been a major new project in the United States in 7 years. Part of our problem is that every time you see dredging, and even our local press in an editorial use the term pork barrel, if we can't convince people that this is not a pork barrel but an absolutely essential federal task, then we're in real trouble. And incidentally, we no longer are even anticipating that the federal government will do what they've done for over 200 years and pay 100% of the financing. In fact, the state of Maryland has indicated that it would be willing, if the federal government would equally share the cost, to try and find a means of paying for that other portion of the dredging contract. No, obviously we are not satisfied, and I think one of the problems, incidentally, is that there was a great interest in dredging when there were 40 or 43 ships sitting down south of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and 103 ships down in Norfolk when we couldn't move coal. The bottom of the coal market fell out, as most of you know, and whether that coal market's going to return is something else again. But we now have a capacity to move 35 million tons of coal out of this port, and we'll move about 8 million tons this year. And as a result, a lot of people feel the pressure for the deeper channel is off. It's simply not true. A world-class port is going to need a 50-foot channel in the 1990s if, in fact, it's going to be a world-class port. The only comfort we have had so far is that nobody else has gotten anything anyway. And I consider that very cold comfort because I don't consider that we are competitive with, for instance, Virginia. We support the Virginia Deep Channel Project as we hope they would support ours. We think it's a national situation. We think it's something that the country has to do, and it just simply has not faced up to it. I would have to be very honest with you, and I would tell you that overall, the biggest problem that you have today that you're facing is not the issue of the 50-foot channel, and it's not the issue of dredging that 50-foot channel. It is simply the issue of an absolutely bodacious deficit that is facing the government and the people of this United States and puts a tremendous amount of pressure against public works projects. A final word, incidentally, so that you all know, as far as the MPA and the Department of Transportation is concerned, please keep in mind that the number one absolutely essential dredging project for this port is the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, the Achilles heel of the Port of Baltimore. It's got to be maintained at 35 feet. It's got to go down further. Second is maintenance, and we're doing that. And third is the 50-foot channel. The C&D Canal is the lifeline of this port, and we have got to battle with everything we have to keep it maintained. It's being maintained right now, and to get it deeper and safer and wider if we can.
There are two questions. The first is, will the Trade Commission report of the governors be released for the edification of the trading industry? And secondly, is the competition too keen, Mr. Helpman, with respect to having to come up with Chesapeake Bay?
As far as the report's concerned, I guess the honest answer is I don't know. I'm told that it will be included in the legislative package. So I think that it will be released publicly in one form or another. Whether it will be released in its unexpurgated form, I'm not sure.
The reference I think you make is for OOCL and NOL. Declaring that they are going to operate out of Norfolk, which is true. And incidentally, we talked to them in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago to find out their reason, and the reason is exactly what you say, and incidentally was not, as stated in the press, that we had either refused to give them something or that they were dissatisfied with the Port of Baltimore. Yes, we have a concern that there is a possibility that what was our geographical advantage now turns into our disadvantage. Our advantage being that we are closest to the biggest market in the United States by 150 miles, our disadvantage being that you have to go up and down the Chesapeake Bay to reach us. That decision was made on that basis. It was made on the basis that this shipping line is going into the round-the-world service and has to cut 3 days off its schedule. The average cost of operating a third-generation class container ship today is somewhere between $1,300 and $1,400 an hour. And if you multiply that by 20 hours, you can see that that is a significant additional cost. In the cases where it is purely a cost decision, I can assure you that we are looking at and are prepared to talk with lines in looking on how we can mitigate that cost. We've already put in volume incentive programs in our tariff to make the cost of the call at Baltimore cheaper at the higher volume levels. If it is purely a matter of scheduling, we do have some problems with that. We do not have any other indications at this time that we are, in effect, facing that problem, but we are aware of it. What we have to do, obviously, is to make the call at Baltimore cheaper and faster. We are prepared to make guarantees both in the form of new facilities, better equipment, and hopefully a little bit more creative, although we think we're pretty creative right now, tariff programs to induce the lines to come in. The competitive world is very, very tough. Well, as far as barge services are concerned, right now, as a matter of fact, we benefit greatly by it. It's an interesting fact that when the announcement was made about those 2 lines going down, it did not receive the same enthusiastic public spread that 2 months ago when Maersk Line announced that they were canceling out in Philadelphia and all the cargo was coming to Baltimore, which probably easily evens out the cargo that we lost in Norfolk. But we do not always have that balance of publicity that we'd like. But the barge situation right now, we handle more barge traffic that is fed to us than we feed to other ports. There is no question about that. The acquisition of Delta Lines by U.S. Lines indicates to us that we'll get Delta Line ship service back in here. So right now we're holding our own. But the trip up and down the bay, yes, to date it has not hurt us. It's something that we have to protect ourselves against as best we can.
I must apologize to Dr. Flax and to others that still have questions. We do have to be reasonably on schedule with respect to the ending of our session.